In the middle of the 5th century BC, the Mediterranean basin was illuminated by the unprecedented cultural and intellectual brilliance of the Greek city-states, a golden age seemingly destined to echo through eternity. Yet beneath the marble monuments and democratic assemblies, a fatal fault line was actively fracturing the Hellenic world. Two diametrically opposed superpowers stood at the precipice of a conflict that would not merely redraw borders, but permanently extinguish the classical era. The looming collision between the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League was a tragedy of inevitable friction, a catastrophic civil war that would ultimately hollow out the cradle of Western civilization. When the Peloponnesian War finally erupted in 431 BC, it shattered a fragile geopolitical balance, plunging the Aegean into a devastating 27-year struggle for absolute supremacy. On one side stood Athens, an audacious naval titan fueled by radical democracy, tribute from subjugated allies, and an unquenchable imperial ambition. Opposing them was Sparta, a hyper-militaristic, deeply conservative land power driven by a rigid oligarchy and a profound paranoia regarding Athenian expansion. This was not a localized border dispute, but a clash of irreconcilable ideologies and grand strategies fought across multiple theaters from the coasts of Asia Minor to the island of Sicily. The initial phase of the conflict was defined by the brilliant, if austere, vision of the Athenian statesman Pericles, who recognized that fighting the invincible Spartan infantry on open ground was tantamount to suicide. Instead, he implemented a radical doctrine of attrition, a military strategy focused on gradually wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse through continuous losses in personnel and materiel. Athens would abandon its countryside, retreat behind the impregnable fortifications of the Long Walls, and rely entirely on its unrivaled navy to secure grain shipments and launch punitive coastal raids against the Peloponnese. Spartan forces, commanded by King Archidamus, executed their counter-strategy with ruthless, methodical precision. Every summer, heavily armored hoplites marched into the region of Attica, systematically torching olive groves, burning farmsteads, and attempting to provoke the Athenian army into a decisive, pitched battle. The ancient rhythm of agricultural life was violently upended, replaced by the suffocating reality of tens of thousands of refugees packed tightly within the sweltering confines of the Athenian fortifications. But grand strategy rarely survives contact with the unpredictable forces of nature, and in 430 BC, an unforeseen variable bypassed the Spartan spears and breached the Long Walls. A devastating plague swept through the overcrowded, unsanitary city with apocalyptic fury, indiscriminately slaughtering an estimated one-third of the Athenian population. The streets became choked with the dead and dying, societal norms disintegrated, and the psychological trauma fundamentally altered the collective psyche of the surviving citizenry. The pestilence claimed Pericles himself, severing the steady hand that had guided the empire's calculated defensive posture. In the power vacuum that followed, a new breed of populist politicians, known as demagogues, seized control of the Democratic Assembly, substituting long-term strategic patience with demands for aggressive, immediate expansion. The war mutated from a controlled, defensive holding action into a volatile, unpredictable offensive campaign driven by the volatile passions of the Athenian mob and the personal ambitions of its new leaders. This shift in leadership raises a critical question that has haunted military theorists for millennia. What happens when a dominant naval power, insulated by wealth and overconfident in its own exceptionalism, fundamentally miscalculates its operational reach? The answer would materialize a decade later in the form of a breathtakingly arrogant military venture that would forever alter the trajectory of the conflict. Athens was about to stake its entire imperial future on a distant, poorly understood theater of war in 415 BC, seduced by the charismatic and reckless Alcibiades. The Athenian assembly authorized the Sicilian expedition, a massive amphibious invasion aimed at conquering the wealthy city of Syracuse. It was an undertaking of staggering proportions, deploying thousands of elite hoplites, countless support personnel, and a vast armada of triremes across the Ionian Sea. However, the command structure was immediately compromised by political infighting, leaving the cautious and reluctant General Nicias in charge of a campaign he fundamentally opposed. The expedition quickly transformed into a masterclass in the unforgiving realities of logistics. The complex military science of planning, moving, and supplying armed forces over extended distances. Operating hundreds of miles from their primary bases, the Athenians struggled to maintain supply lines, secure reliable local intelligence, and adapt to the unfamiliar terrain of the Sicilian coast. The sheer friction of projecting power across the Mediterranean began to degrade their operational effectiveness long before the decisive engagements occurred. The climax at Syracuse was an unmitigated catastrophe for the invaders, a slow-motion disaster culminating in the total annihilation of the Athenian expeditionary force in 413 BC. Trapped in the Great Harbor, the once invincible Athenian fleet was systematically dismantled by Syracusan and Spartan naval reinforcements, while the retreating land army was hunted down and slaughtered at the Acinarus River. As the ancient historian Thucydides grimly observed, they were destroyed with a total destruction. Their fleet, their army, everything was ruined, and few out of many returned home. The shockwave of the Sicilian disaster reverberated across the Aegean, instantly shattering the aura of Athenian invincibility and triggering a cascade of rebellions among their subjugated allies. Seizing the moment of unprecedented weakness, Sparta established a permanent fortified garrison at Decelia, just miles from Athens, effectively placing the city under a year-round siege and severing its access to vital silver mines. The strategic initiative had decisively shifted, forcing the crumbling empire into a desperate existential fight for survival. Recognizing that Athens could only be truly defeated on the waves, Sparta made a pragmatic and deeply controversial geopolitical maneuver, entering into an alliance with their ancestral enemy, the Persian Empire. This arrangement birthed the devastating proxy war, a conflict where a major power instigates or funds hostilities through a third party without becoming directly involved in the fighting. Persian gold flowed into Spartan coffers, financing the construction of massive fleets and the hiring of elite rowers, effectively neutralizing Athens' historical naval advantage under the command of the cunning and ruthless Spartan Admiral Lysander. The nature of naval warfare in the Aegean underwent a radical evolution. Lysander eschewed traditional head-on fleet engagements, opting instead to target Athenian supply lines and force engagements only when he possessed overwhelming tactical superiority. The conflict became a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Hellespont, with the survival of the Athenian populace entirely dependent on the uninterrupted flow of grain from the Black Sea. The fatal blow was struck in 405 BC at the Battle of Aegospotami, a masterstroke of tactical deception and opportunistic aggression. Catching the Athenian fleet beached and unprepared on the shores of the Hellespont, Lysander's forces annihilated their entire naval capacity in a single devastating afternoon, capturing thousands of prisoners and executing them on the spot. The vital grain route was severed permanently, transforming the strategic blockade into a literal death sentence for the besieged city. Trapped behind their once impregnable long walls, the citizens of Athens faced the agonizing reality of total starvation as the winter of 404 BC set in. The bustling markets fell silent, the democratic assembly dissolved into despair, and the proud metropolis was reduced to a hollow shell of suffering and capitulation. Without a single ship to defend their harbor, the Athenians surrendered unconditionally, accepting terms that stripped them of their empire, their fleet, and their formidable fortifications. Spartan victory ushered in a brutal new era of hegemony, a geopolitical state where one dominant nation exercises total political, economic, and military control over its weaker neighbors. The victors dismantled the Athenian democracy, installing a ruthless oligarchic regime known as the 30 Tyrants, who initiated a reign of terror, executing political opponents and confiscating wealth. The promise of liberation that Sparta had championed at the war's outset evaporated, replaced by an iron-fisted imperialism that proved even more oppressive than Athenian rule. Yet the Spartan triumph contained the seeds of its own rapid destruction, exposing a profound inability to govern the vast, complex empire they had suddenly inherited. Their rigid, insular society was fundamentally ill-equipped to manage overseas territories, and the influx of foreign wealth deeply corrupted their traditional austere values. The very military machine that had conquered Greece began to rust from the inside out, plagued by severe demographic decline and the constant threat of Helot uprisings in their home territories. The true tragedy of the Peloponnesian War was that there were no genuine victors, only varying degrees of devastation that permanently crippled the entire classical Greek world. Decades of relentless slaughter, scorched earth tactics, and economic exhaustion had drained the city-states of their manpower, their wealth, and their innovative spirit. The Hellenic landscape fractured into a chaotic mosaic of perpetually warring factions, locked in a cycle of petty conflicts that prevented any single power from establishing lasting stability. This pervasive exhaustion created a massive geopolitical vacuum at the absolute worst possible moment in ancient history, while Sparta, Athens, and later Thebes squandered their remaining strength in endless, localized squabbles. A new, highly militarized power was quietly consolidating its strength on the northern periphery of the Greek world. The classical city-states, blinded by their historical rivalries, failed to recognize the existential threat gathering in the rugged mountains of Macedon. Under the visionary leadership of King Philip II, and later his son Alexander the Great, Macedon exploited the fractured, weakened state of southern Greece to assert absolute dominance over the peninsula. The Macedonian phalanx, a revolutionary tactical innovation, easily swept aside the exhausted hoplite armies that had spent the last century bleeding each other dry. The era of the fiercely independent democratic city-state was violently terminated, replaced by the sprawling autocratic empires of the Hellenistic age. One must wonder how the trajectory of Western civilization might have shifted had Athens and Sparta found a diplomatic resolution to their escalating paranoia in 431 BC. A united Hellenic front, combining Athenian naval brilliance with Spartan martial discipline, could have easily deterred Macedonian expansion and perhaps even challenged the rising power of Rome centuries later. Instead, their irreconcilable hubris ensured that their greatest achievements would be inherited by conquerors rather than preserved by their descendants. Investigating the Peloponnesian War reveals the ultimate historical cautionary tale. A stark demonstration of how internal division and strategic overreach can dismantle even the most brilliant of civilizations. The strategic decisions made in the assemblies of Athens and the barracks of Sparta did not merely decide the fate of a single conflict. They irrevocably shifted the eras of human history. The classical Greek Golden Age was not assassinated by foreign invaders, but rather it committed a slow, agonizing suicide upon the altars of ambition and fear.